Good evening, and welcome to CITI Media Reporter. I'm Howard Homanoff, and thank you for joining us. Our guest this evening is Michael Shapiro, professor of journalism at the Columbia Journalism School, and the founder of a startup media company, which we'll be talking about, called The Big Roundtable. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with an easy one. Give us your State of the Union today for journalism. Where is it? How should we think about it today?
It's an interesting question. I get asked this a lot, and the answer kind of depends generationally. If you speak to people of my generation, I started working in newspapers in 1976, it is sackcloth and ashes. Things are terrible. Look what's happened to our business. All that we hold dear is lost. If you speak to people a generation behind, for instance, the generation that my daughter, a journalist, is in, things have never been better. And in fact, I'm more from the latter camp, because the fact is that what the digital changes in journalism have wrought is more excitement than I have seen in this field in all the time that I've been in it. That's not to say things are easy. Media companies across the country, especially across the world really, especially legacy media companies, are struggling mightily to try to sort out what is the new way that we're going to create business models, not the old model, which was advertising, certainly in newspapers, advertising fueled and really advertising based. And so now the possibilities of what journalism can do, how we tell stories, what it means, what a story means, those things are being debated in the most interesting ways that I can remember in a generation.
So why does it feel like when you read about the media, talking about the media, it is so much that sackcloth and ashes?
Well,
and maybe that it's a perception, not necessarily reality, but it certainly feels like the perception about it.
Well, remember, there's two things happening simultaneously. Not to go all Shakespearean, but there are weddings and there are funerals in this story. The weddings are new startup, some company just got $100 million to come up with X. The funerals, which are the stories that sadly last, are of 50 buyouts here, 100 layoffs there, someone who had been a reporter for 35 years and is pushing into his or her late 50s or early 60s, is out of work. And those stories, sad stories, are the ones that we remember, and there are, make no mistake about it, the great tidal wave of change that has happened to journalism really since 2000. Changes began in the mid-90s, but really accelerating in the early 2000s, has wrought enormous consequences, both in terms of creation and destruction. And so you're really getting both. And I don't think it's really unusual that the sad stories are the ones that people talk about longer.
Yeah. So where's the journalism that you kind of look to today for whether established still or more innovative that kind of gets you as somebody who teaches this stuff for a living? What do you get most excited about in terms of the content you're seeing in the news business?
Well, what's interesting about it is that I'm an old dog in this thing, and so I have habits that I've had for a long time. I read the New York Times every day, but I also have a Twitter feed and I have a Facebook page, and I look at that news feed. News comes to me from so many different sources. I'm aware of where it's coming from. And like everybody, I'm my own best curator. Like, am I going to believe this or not going to believe that? And what's coming to me? And what do I choose to pay attention to? And what do I choose to ignore? And in that sense, it's exciting. When I was first starting out, I was working in a small newspaper in New Jersey. And one of the thrills, because I was working in a small newspaper in New Jersey, was to come into Manhattan and go to Times Square, and you could pick up when you were looking for another job. You could go to a place called Hodeling's, which was on 42nd Street between 6th and 7th. And Hodeling's had all the out-of-town newspapers across the country, and it was great. You could pick up the Minneapolis Star Tribune, you could pick up the Fort Lauderdale, you could pick up anything 2 or 3 days late, and you got a sense of what was going on across the country. Nothing in my mind seems more quaint than the image of Hodeling's, which of course is not there anymore. Then the idea that you would actually go to a store and pick up out-of-town newspapers, because the sources of information that you got were primarily newspapers or magazines. They were all physical. You had to get them, you had to buy them or have it delivered to you. The process was so slow, and yet the process was extremely profitable. You have to remember, if we're just talking about newspapers, that was a great business. I mean, the newspaper business, just all you need to know is this, the operative verb in the terms of business and newspapers. The chief source of, obviously, newspapers were built on advertising. The biggest source of, most profitable source of advertising in newspapers was classified ads. Before there was something called Craigslist, it was classified ads. To sell classified ads, you didn't go out and have to sell them. There was nothing volitional on your part. You didn't have to go out and knock on doors going, please, please. What you did was you took the ads, which meant you sat at your desk.
Inbound marketing, always much easier than outbound. Yeah.
All right. And typically what happened, certainly in the years after World War II, was fewer and fewer cities had multiple newspapers. You had mostly monopoly stakes in most. You remember, New York, when I was a kid, had 7 newspapers, then 5, and fewer and fewer and fewer. Chicago had 3, now it has 2. But cities across the country had multiple newspapers. Most of the afternoon newspapers, with the advent of TV, beginning in the 1950s, became extinct. And so eventually what happened is that most cities across the country had one newspaper which dominated the region and dominated classified advertising. And if you were a classified ad salesman or saleswoman, all you did was pick up the phone and go, it'll be this much if you want to list your house, this much if you want to list a death, this much. It was just, and then one day along comes Craig Newmark, and he starts a little newsletter for his friends. And it goes boom. So people from my generation, looking for the devil, who do we hold responsible for the great catastrophe that has befallen us? Go, it's his fault. It's Craig Newmark's fault. He ruined everything. He made it free and easy and searchable. So on one hand, you feel terribly sorry for the men and women who worked in news organizations who, because their companies did not see what was coming and didn't adapt quickly enough, all of a sudden see their companies diminish, 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 diminish. The amount of money spent on journalism diminish, 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 and jobs go along with that. But Craig Newmark didn't do anything wrong. He just did something smart. Look, newspapers, especially, and because so much of journalism is built on newspapers as well as radio, television, and magazines. But if you just think about newspapers, what we consider the great source of news, certainly traditionally, was a business that was so ripe for disruption that it's frightening. If Clayton Christensen, the author of The Innovator's Dilemma, could have picked a better industry in which to prove the theory of disruptive technology, he couldn't have chosen a better one than the newspaper business, because everything was there. The legacy, the image of all that we hold sacred will go on forever, a traditional way of doing things, and too often lacking the capacity to see the change that was coming. And that is a sad story. And as I was saying earlier, tragedies are always better stories than comedies.
Yeah. So are we going to see, or maybe they're already around today, they just don't dress as well, but the Ben Bradleys, okay, we just lost Ben Bradley, and it was a chance to sort of go back and relive some of the glories of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, et cetera. Do we not need Ben Bradleys in a sense in the same way anymore? Are they there? They just don't look as sharp, and their schooling isn't necessarily the same. What does the today and the future look like for the dashing editor that we sort of have in our mind?
First of all, now more than ever, and I should say, Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, great dresser.
Okay, excellent.
But
so that's good to know. So we've got that covered. Yeah.
But what you're seeing, and I think that one of the interesting things that's happened as we go through all this change, and the world is polluted is perhaps too strong a word, but you take my point, with so many digital media gurus who go, I've looked in, the way Johnny Carson used to put on the big turban and look into the future, as Karnak would go and look into the future, and I see print will be dead in 5 years. That was 7 years ago. Guess what? It's not dead. Or for sure this is what's going to happen, or everybody will be their own curator. Speaking with a certainty that can only come with a supremely blind or hubristically confident. The fact is, one of the things that's been interesting to see evolve is that with the increased speed of broadband, increased speed with how much information you can get so quickly, with the advent around the world of mobile. Remember, mobile has been a transformative experience not only for the West, but in countries that had landline systems in which if you placed a call in New Delhi in the morning, hopefully it would have gotten to the other side of New Delhi by the afternoon. Now everybody's got a cell phone. And information is coming in torrents and in speed, and the technology gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So I think it is a pretty clear indication now that what you need and what people want, because it's been shown, this is not just anecdotal or speculative, is that they need good curators. It used to be if you were the editor of a big newspaper like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, your job was to come in the morning. You were typically a man. Your job was to come in the morning and spend the day figuring out what was going to be in that next day's newspaper. Those days are so innocently remembered, like that's all you had to do. Now you are a wire service. You are a social media presence. You are worrying about video. You're worrying about a whole host of ways to disseminate stories. Plus, you're worrying about business. You're worrying about a host of things that your predecessors never had to deal with. But at the end of the day, your job is to figure out, how am I serving this reader? You know, it's interesting. My wife, who is also a journalist, and I were, some time ago, were sitting at a B&B. And it turns out there was a guy on the business side of a competing news organization. And he came up with, to my mind, was the best distillation of what news was. He goes, news is what I need to help me make decisions. And I'm thinking, I've been doing this for a long time, as is my wife, and I go, how come I wasn't that smart to think of that? But it was perfect. News is what I need to help me make decisions. We're not talking about feature writing or stories that we read for pleasure. We're talking about news in whatever form it takes. With that in mind, I need somebody to guide me. I don't want to just be hit with a torrent of stuff. I need somebody to help me navigate my day. Twitter is everybody's own personal RSS feed. Right. Really simple syndication. Yep. I'm choosing to follow these people, but if you think about the experience of Twitter, and here I'll confess to being old, I find Twitter overwhelming. I can't sit there and keep up with, every time I turn away, 45 new tweets. Right. And maybe 1 in 20 I'll pick out and go, that looks interesting. Maybe I'll do a search if it has something to do with information that I need. But the fact is, we need those editors. We need the Ben Bradleys, we need the Abe Rosenthal's, we need the Sandy Rhodes, all the great editors we've always had, because we need men and women to say, look, based upon our considered opinion, look over here. This matters. The front page, as it were, whether you're on a home page or a physical front page, matters. We're making decisions. You're free to accept or reject them, but we're going to help you because that's our job. And that is why there are professional journalists. That is why I work in a place that teaches people how to be professional journalists. There are a lot of things that go into training a journalist. You have to learn how to write, you have to learn how to report, but really what you're learning how to do is frame questions and answer them. And you have, as a journalist, the most important thing you have to do is make decisions. Citizen journalists, taking nothing away from them. I love citizen journalists. I embrace them. But citizen journalists are really, really, really knowledgeable about what's going on in the world that they know. If you want to know what's going on in Kashmir right now, on a particular square mile of Kashmir between India and Pakistan, that person, that citizen journalist on the ground right now who's been there for 20 years, that man or woman knows more than I can ever know as a trained journalist who can go there and ask questions. The difference between a citizen journalist and a professional journalist is my job, and what I'm teaching students at the journalism school to do, is to figure out what are the questions that have to be answered and to answer them about information that heretofore I knew very little, if nothing about. And that is a skill, because at the end of the day, I have to make decisions. what's the most important thing that happened today? What's, as they say in my trade, what's the verb in the lead? Is the most important thing what somebody said, what somebody did? Was it the number of people who were killed? Was it the signing of a peace accord? And making those decisions has basically been the heart of journalism forever. And making that decision is the beginning of curation. And it takes skill and practice. And that's why, as a young journalist, I wince at the memories of all the really dumb decisions I made. That's not to say that I make brilliant decisions at the age of 60. I don't. But I just seasoned, but I certainly have more experience of going, oh, no, you're going to make a mistake if you do that.
So we haven't yet touched on the video world, and we've been focused sort of, understandably, sort of in a historical perspective, newspapers particularly, magazines, print. What's your take on where the video journalism world is? And maybe start with cable, and kind of what, there was probably, my sense is, a lot more hope associated with what 24-hour-a-day news channels were going to mean for journalism than where we are. But that's my take. What's your sense of video news, and it could be worldwide, not just U.S., and where with digital that may be going?
Well, it's a very good question about video, because for many news organizations, there's a really firm and growing belief that video is where the future is in terms of business, that there's in a lot of investment in video. And the other day, it's interesting you should ask that question, because as you were asking, two images came to mind. One is sitting in a newsroom, which often newsrooms across the country have CNN on, or sitting in a doctor's office or a train station, and then CNN is on all the time. And unless there's a really, really important breaking story, what CNN is an endless loop of the same footage, again and again and again. That was Ted Turner's dream of 24-hour continuous news. When you have Tiananmen Square, when you have the Chilean miners, when you have events that warrant endless coverage, it is fantastic. When Mubarak fell in Egypt, I had my computer open to Al Jazeera all the time, because they had a camera on Tahrir Square, and I could watch it in real time. It was thrilling to see. And even though I could read stuff, I wanted to watch it. The rest of the time, how many times can I watch yet another dress rehearsal for yet another Kardashian wedding? Sorry. On the other hand, a couple of weeks ago, it was a really remarkable thing that the Times ran. It was a 7.5-minute video of an ambulance driver in Monrovia. And it was a portrait of what Ebola looks like through the prism of one man who was an ambulance driver. 7.5 minutes, that's a long time. And I was very conscious afterwards.
Let me just interrupt. Yeah. Was it professionally done, sort of edited, and this wasn't citizen journalism in this case?
This was professionally done. It was done by a videographer with a team, with sound, somebody who knew what he was doing and did it well. And so a couple of things when I think about that. One, I was sitting at my desk, watching it on my desktop, which is, I wasn't supposed to be on my desktop, I was supposed to be on my phone or on an iPad or outside, but I was sitting at my desk and I'm looking at this and I couldn't turn away from it. It was so powerfully done, so riveting, and telling a story is a hard thing to do. We all assume we know how to tell stories, but we all also know what makes an interesting story versus a dull story, because we all go to the movies and read books and watch television. A few days later, the Times followed it up with a print story about the same guy. And I'm asking myself, why are you doing that? Everything I saw in that video. It was a remarkable thing. And I would have watched it on my phone. I happened to be sitting at my desk. So a couple of things. Several years ago, Jonah Peretti, one of the founders of Huffington Post and founder of BuzzFeed, came across, in the many discoveries that we have in the new journalism landscape, an so easily overlooked, but nonetheless borderline genius discovery called the Bored at Work Network. What Jonah Peretti, who does not come from a journalistic background, he was a high school science teacher, and kind of a prankster and a very interesting, smart guy, discovers, is that many people in this world do not like their jobs.
Wait, let me write that down. I'm sorry. We have breaking news. Breaking news.
Do not like their jobs. Many of those people sit in cubicles, and at that cubicle is a computer. And they're sitting there going, and they're bored at work. So what Jonah Peretti said is that if you're bored at work, let me give you something to alleviate your boredom. So you can't just give one thing at a time. So he's sitting there like with a t-shirt cannon at a sports, boom, 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 anything. So how do you explain the phenomenon of Charlie bit my finger? Remember Charlie bit my finger, right? 750 million people have downloaded. I looked at this the other day. Because somebody's at board and go, somebody's at work and they're bored. And look, somebody sends it to them and they go, that's funny. 4 seconds, you send it to a friend. And it alleviates your boredom. That is fascinating to see. What he realized was he can create a network around information that people found useful. Now, in this case, the use of that for your customer was, I need to resolve my boredom for a minute. Nobody's looking. Let me look at this thing, put my headphones on. What are you doing in there, Johnson? Nothing, right? And then I can have I can resolve a little bit of my boredom. B, I can connect with my friends. C, I can be part of a network of something happening. If you think about that for a second, and I know I'm moving away from video, let's say Charlie bit my finger is a silly, funny video whose success is beyond explaining. But that 7-minute video, you'll find that on Facebook, and you'll find it on Twitter, and you'll get shared again and again and again, because it's what people are asking for is, how do I know Ebola is a big story, and I don't want to read everything about it, and do I really, it's so sad and dying, and what if I get it? And if I watch that 7.5-minute video, I've seen everything I need to see about how awful it is, the way a movie will haunt you afterwards. So video and the opportunity to see video on a host of platforms and through a variety of sources is transformative. And again, you can get footage as somebody shooting on their phone. Look, I mean, it's remarkable. Photographs and decent resolution video that somebody's shooting on their phone. And frankly, if you're the only person there, that can be news. I mean, that can really be news. How many people wanted after the shooting this summer in Missouri, wanted to have video that somebody had shot? Think about how powerful those images are. So video, both amateurishly, I'm not saying that pejoratively, but by a citizen journalist or professionally done, is a transformative bit of technology. Not only in terms of that, and not only in terms of the product itself, but for the sharing part of it, which is a whole different way to see how journalism is disseminated.
So let me switch gears here and talk a little bit about your entrepreneurial endeavor and the Big Round Table, and kind of what was the hook or interest in that particular. Tell us first of all a little bit about what it is, and then why was that kind of where you went? It's
the Big Round Table is a publisher of original, what is now known in the trade as long-form journalism. Big, long narrative stories, nonfiction stories. And we've been around since late July of 2013, and this week we'll be publishing our 25th story. We do 2 long stories a month. And really what it's built on, it's a very simple thing. And I think that one of the things that I've discovered coming from a journalism background, first newspapers and magazines and books and teaching as well, is that going to business was, you had to say that you were in a business. For a long time I said, well, it's a project, it's this thing, this endeavor, this enterprise. No, it's a business. Was that it takes, and I was saying to somebody the other day, starting a business, I've now discovered, is not unlike the beginnings of a relationship. You begin a relationship, we go, how do we know if this is going to work? We go, we don't know if it's going to work. Well, how do you know what's going to happen at the end? I have no idea. And someplace along the line, if it's going to work, the relationship enters into a rhythm. Not so much you're finishing each other's sentences, but you get into a rhythm with each other. And I think that what happened for us, and I suspect happens to lots of businesses, as it happens to most relationships that work, is that about a year or so into it, I go, I realize what we're doing. This is all about discovery. We're in the story discovery business. If we can keep everything seen through the frame of one word, discovery, writers in the stories being discovered and readers discovering stories that surprise them, then we have a rhythm to what we're doing. So you asked me, though, how this started. And there was a study done. I think you and I had talked about this once before. There was a study done some years ago at the Kaufman Center for Entrepreneurial Research. I think that's in Kansas City. They reported that just under 50% of all startups that were still in business 5 years after they'd started, which means that they were successful, were started by somebody who had a personal need in their own lives to address. And that was my story. Mm-hmm. You know, I spent a lot of time on young entrepreneurs. I love young entrepreneurs, but one thing I've discovered is a lot of young entrepreneurs go, I want to start a business and I'm going to do this thing, but they can't answer the question of why. So too with a lot of young journalists. I'm going to tell a story about this. And I go, why do you need to tell the story? In fact, one of the things that we do on the Big Round Table when we come up with the new stories, we always ask the writer, and we post it on our newsletter, to explain why did you need to write this story. So I needed to start the Big Round Table to fix a problem in my own life and discover that it wasn't just my problem alone. About 3 years ago, I am what is known in the trade as your proverbial mid-list author. I had written 6 books, and I was certainly a beneficiary of the old order. I'd written for the New Yorker and the New York Times Magazine and Sports Illustrated. I was doing just fine. And lo and behold, one day in the course of this disruption, because disruption is hitting the publishing business as well, I come up with an idea for a book, and my agent goes, well, I'm not sure. Why don't you reconsider it this way? I reconsider it back and forth, reconsidering this idea. So I come to my agent, who's been my agent for 28 years, and he goes, I can't sell this. And my heart, why not? He goes, the world that you and I came of age in has changed. And unless there's so much pressure now because publishing has been consolidated into five big publishing houses, unless you can come up with an idea that is a surefire seller, you're toast. That hurt my feelings. Because how was I supposed to know? No one can know whether something is going to sell or not. The past is not necessarily indication of what's going to happen looking forward. So I began to talk with friends of mine who were Pulitzer Prize-winning authors, and turns out the same thing happened to them, that there was so much pressure to come up with something that was a surefire success that the risk part in publishing was taken out of it. Well, I knew there were a lot of writers who could still write. And from there, I moved away from a place where I can write my own stuff to see if I could create a platform that would basically be disruptive. If everybody else was doing all this cool disruptive stuff, I wanted to also. But when you do that, you move away from just being disruptive in a nihilistic way to sort of thinking, I can create something brand new. And that's what the Big Round Table became.
Great. Well, with that, I will say thank you to Michael Shapiro, and thank you for joining us on CITI Media Reporter. Good night.